Imagine waking to the rhythmic thud of iron-tipped battering rams against limestone walls. The sound reverberates through your chest before your mind can process what it means. You've heard the stories, of course. Everyone has. But stories are abstractions until the morning you see smoke rising from the neighboring city, until you watch your own king's advisors arguing in frantic whispers about whether to open the gates now or wait until the Assyrians build their siege ramps higher. The choice seems impossible because both options lead to the same place, a world where your life is no longer your own, where survival becomes a matter of arbitrary selection, where the color of dawn might be the last beautiful thing you ever see without chains around your wrists. Before we go further, if you're fascinated by the darker corners of ancient history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into the past. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. It's genuinely incredible to see this global community of people drawn to understanding how our ancestors lived, suffered, and endured. Here's the unsettling truth about the Assyrian Empire. It didn't rule the ancient Near East for 3 centuries through superior philosophy or enlightened governance. It ruled through the systematic weaponization of terror, turning cruelty into policy and fear into the mortar that held together the largest empire the world had yet seen. Between roughly 911 and 612 BCE, the Assyrians transformed warfare itself, creating mechanisms of control so efficient, so thoroughly documented in their own proud inscriptions, that historians today can reconstruct exactly how they broke entire civilizations. You wouldn't survive a single day in their empire, not because you lacked courage or intelligence, but because survival itself was never the point. Compliance was. And the Assyrians had perfected the art of making people comply. The Assyrian heartland sat in northern Mesopotamia, centered on cities like Ashur, Nineveh, and Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, along the Tigris River. This was not lush, easily defended territory. It was a relatively small region surrounded by rivals, the Babylonians to the south, the Elamites to the east, the Hittites, and later the Arameans to the north and west. Geography gave the Assyrians no natural advantage. What transformed them from a regional power into an empire spanning from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt was a conscious choice to make warfare not seasonal, not defensive but perpetual and industrial. We know this because the Assyrians told us. Their kings commissioned scribes to record every campaign, every tribute received, every city destroyed. These annals, carved into palace walls and inscribed on clay prisms, were not private records but public declarations. King Ashurbanipal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, had reliefs installed in his throne room at Kalhu, showing prisoners being flayed alive, their skin draped over city walls. Foreign ambassadors waiting for an audience would stand surrounded by these images. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who resist. The empire reached its zenith under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BCE, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal. At its height in the 7th century BCE, Assyrian territory stretched from Cyprus in the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of Urartu southward into Egypt. The scale is difficult to comprehend. This wasn't a loose confederation, but a tightly administered empire with governors, tax collectors, military garrisons, and an intelligence network that reported potential rebellions before they could organize. But size alone doesn't explain why the Assyrian Empire occupies such a unique place in historical memory. Other empires grew large. What made Assyria different was its explicit policy of calculated terror as the primary instrument of control. The Assyrians didn't stumble into brutality as a byproduct of conquest. They refined it, systematized it, and documented it with the pride of craftsmen perfecting a technique. To understand what a single day in their empire might mean, we need to understand the machinery they built and how it operated on every level of society. The transformation of Assyrian military power began with a revolution that sounds administrative but changed everything: the creation of the ancient world's first true standing professional army. Before Tiglath-Pileser III's reforms, Assyrian forces, like those of their neighbors, consisted primarily of farmers and laborers conscripted seasonally. Men fought between spring planting and autumn harvest, then returned home. This model imposed natural limits on warfare. Campaigns had to be short. Sieges lasting months were impossible when your soldiers needed to return for harvest. Multi-front operations couldn't be sustained. Tiglath-Pileser III dismantled this system entirely. He created a permanent military force, soldiers who trained year-round, received regular pay from the royal treasury, and whose only occupation was war. Units specialized: heavy infantry with iron-tipped spears and rectangular shields, archers trained to loose arrows in coordinated volleys, cavalry mounted on horses bred for endurance, siege engineers who understood mathematics and leverage. The Assyrians didn't invent iron metallurgy, but they industrialized it, producing weapons and armor on a scale that gave them material superiority over bronze-equipped rivals. The strategic implications were staggering. An Assyrian king could now launch campaigns in any season. Winter campaigns, previously unthinkable, became routine. The empire could maintain multiple armies in different theaters simultaneously, one force pacifying rebellious cities in the Levant while another campaigned against mountain tribes in the north. Most significantly, the Assyrians could conduct the prolonged sieges that broke fortified cities. When Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem in 701 BCE, his forces surrounded the city for months, building siege ramps, cutting supply lines, waiting for starvation to do what battering rams could not. This professionalization created a feedback loop of expansion. Each conquered territory provided more tribute to fund the army. More funding meant more soldiers, better equipment, improved logistics. The Assyrians built roads throughout their empire, not for commerce, but for moving troops rapidly. Archaeological surveys have traced these routes, straighter and better maintained than anything that would exist in the region for another 1,000 years. Supply depots along these roads stockpiled grain, weapons, and equipment so armies could campaign far from the Assyrian heartland without losing effectiveness. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Assyrian military machine was its relentlessness. The empire conducted annual campaigns. Every single year, without exception, the army marched out, sometimes to conquer new territory, sometimes to suppress rebellions, often simply to extract tribute and remind subject peoples of Assyrian power. For populations under Assyrian rule, this created an unbearable reality. You could surrender immediately, accept their governors, pay their taxes, and follow their laws. Yet still, each spring, you would watch Assyrian armies march through your territory, requisitioning additional supplies, conscripting able-bodied men, extracting tribute beyond what you'd already paid. The records are explicit. Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 858 to 824 BCE, campaigned for 31 of his 35 years on the throne. His annals record battle after battle, siege after siege, tribute after tribute. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser, discovered at Kalhu, shows delegations from across the empire bringing tribute: horses, camels, gold, silver, exotic animals. These weren't gifts, but payments extracted under threat of annihilation. One delegation shown on the obelisk is from Israel, led by King Jehu. The biblical text doesn't mention this tribute, but the stone doesn't lie. Jehu prostrates himself before Assyrian power because the alternative is what happened to cities that refused. For civilians throughout the empire, this meant no safe distance from violence existed. Your sons would be conscripted to fight Assyrian wars. Your harvest would feed Assyrian armies. Your labor would build their fortifications. Any reluctance, any sign of resistance would bring the full weight of Assyrian military power down upon your city. They could not look away from the dust clouds on the horizon that signaled another army's approach. They could not pretend the system would spare them through passivity. When a city rebelled against Assyrian rule, the response followed a protocol so consistent that subject peoples could predict exactly what would happen. This predictability was itself a weapon. The Assyrian army would arrive and send heralds to the gates offering terms: surrender immediately, hand over your leaders, and receive relatively lenient treatment, or resist and face systematic destruction. Those terms were never negotiable, never revised. The psychological pressure was immense because everyone knew what lenient treatment meant and what systematic destruction entailed. The choice wasn't between freedom and subjugation, but between degrees of suffering. For cities that surrendered quickly, the process was almost bureaucratic. Assyrian officials would enter, conduct a census, assess tribute obligations, install a governor, or oversee the existing one, and depart with hostages, typically sons of the ruling family, who would be educated in Assyrian ways at the capital. The city's life would continue, though its resources now flowed to Nineveh. Men would be conscripted for labor or military service, but families could stay together, local worship could continue, and daily life retained some semblance of normalcy. For cities that resisted, the protocol was equally systematic, but designed for maximum psychological impact. After the siege ended, and Assyrian sieges always ended in victory, the city's leaders would be brought before Assyrian commanders for public execution. The methods were specific and symbolic. Flaying was reserved for kings and high officials. The fatal removal of skin, performed while the victim remained conscious, carried out in the city's main square, where the population was forced to watch. The removed skin would then be draped over the city walls or stuffed and mounted on poles, a permanent installation reminding anyone who approached what happened to those who claimed authority independent of Assyria. Ashurbanipal II's annals describe these executions with procedural precision. I flayed the nobles who had rebelled, and I spread their skins out on the piles of corpses. Some I impaled upon stakes, others I bound to stakes around the city. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lachish, destroyed by Sennacherib in 701 BCE reveals mass graves showing trauma consistent with impalement. Iron stakes, shaped specifically for this purpose, have been recovered from Assyrian military sites. Common soldiers and fighters faced execution by impalement. Not the quick impalement of later European practice, but a method designed to prolong dying. Stakes were inserted to avoid major organs, allowing victims to survive for hours or even days, displayed around the conquered city so anyone approaching would see dozens or hundreds of men in the process of dying. The visual message was unmistakable. Resistance leads not to honorable death in battle, but to prolonged public suffering. The civilian population faced different horrors, calculated not for their destruction but for their dispersion. Women and children would be spared immediate death, but only to be categorized, counted, and processed. Those with valuable skills, weavers, potters, scribes, would be marked for deportation to the Assyrian heartland. Agricultural workers might be sent to recently depopulated regions hundreds of miles away. The elderly and infirm, those with no labor value, faced execution or abandonment. Men of fighting age who had actively resisted might be blinded, a procedure carried out with heated metal implements, leaving them without sight to wander as living warnings. Others suffered amputation, losing hands or feet or ears, disfigurements that marked them permanently as defeated enemies. Sargon II's annals record, "I made a pile of their heads over against their city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls." The language is clinical, administrative. These weren't actions taken in the heat of battle, but policies implemented after victory, when resistance had ended and prisoners were helpless. The executions served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the king's absolute power over life and death. They satisfied what Assyrians viewed as divine justice. Rebels against Assyria were rebels against the god Ashur himself. Most importantly, they sent an unmistakable message to other cities contemplating resistance. Assyrian palace reliefs, the massive stone carvings that lined throne rooms and public halls, show these scenes in meticulous detail. At Nineveh, the palace of Sennacherib features panels showing the siege and destruction of Lachish. Soldiers are shown methodically executing prisoners. Families are depicted being led away in chains. Bodies lie heaped outside city gates. And in every scene, Assyrian soldiers are calm, methodical, almost casual in their brutality. These images were meant to be seen by foreign ambassadors, by tribute bearers from across the empire, ensuring that word of Assyrian methods spread throughout the known world. They could not look away from the carvings that turned human suffering into decoration, could not pretend that the empire's power rested on anything but the willingness to inflict unimaginable pain on those who refused to submit. In 722 BCE, after a 3-year siege, the Assyrian king Sargon II captured Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. What happened next provides a case study in how Assyrian deportation policy operated at the individual level, how the machinery of empire transformed the lives of specific human beings whose names and stories have been partially preserved. Sargon's annals record the outcome with bureaucratic precision. "I besieged and conquered Samaria, led away as booty 27,280 inhabitants of it." 27,280 people. Not an estimate, but a count, recorded by scribes who tallied each person as they were processed. These weren't soldiers or officials, but the civilian population. craftsmen and farmers, merchants and priests, women and children, families who had lived in Samaria for generations. Imagine being one of those 27,280. You survived the siege, 3 years of diminishing food supplies, watching your neighbors weaken from hunger, burying those who died from starvation or disease. When the walls finally fell, you expected death, but death doesn't come. Instead, you're herded into the city's main square with thousands of others. Assyrian scribes move through the crowd with clay tablets, dividing people into categories. You're a potter. Your hands are examined, calloused in the specific ways that come from working clay. You're marked for deportation to Nineveh, where the empire's expansion requires craftsmen to produce vessels for the royal household. Your neighbor, a farmer, is marked for deportation to Media, modern-day Iran, to work newly conquered agricultural land. Your neighbor's wife, a weaver, is marked for a different destination. Their children, too young to have useful skills, are marked as general laborers. The family tries to stay together. They beg, they plead. The Assyrian officials don't respond with cruelty or anger. They simply separate the family according to their categories. This isn't personal. It's administration. The goal isn't to cause suffering for its own sake, but to redistribute the empire's human resources, where they will be most valuable to Assyrian interests. The journey begins weeks later. After all, 27,280 people have been categorized and organized into deportation columns. You walk. The empire hasn't provided wagons for most deportees. Those too young or old or sick to walk are carried by family members or left behind. The Assyrian military escort is professional, not needlessly brutal, because you're valuable property that needs to arrive in working condition. But the distance is staggering. From Samaria to Nineveh is roughly 500 miles. At a walking pace of 15 miles per day, accounting for rest days, the journey takes 2 months. You walk through territories that were once independent kingdoms, now administered by Assyrian governors. You pass other deportation columns heading in different directions, populations from conquered cities being redistributed across the empire. In one column you recognize the dialect of Aramaic spoken by people from Damascus, conquered 15 years earlier. They're being sent west while you're being sent east. The scale of displacement becomes visible. This isn't just happening to your city. It's happening everywhere, constantly, a permanent reshuffling of millions of people. The psychological toll is harder to measure than the physical suffering, but the biblical texts preserve fragments of it. The Book of Kings, compiled partly from court records and partly from collective memory, describes the deportation from Samaria with a grief that transcends historical documentation. The prophets speak of populations living in permanent fear, knowing that their national identity, the thing that made them a people rather than just a collection of individuals, was being systematically erased. When you finally reach Nineveh after 2 months of walking, the city's scale staggers you. Walls stretch beyond sight, gates flanked by massive stone bulls with human heads, carved 15 feet tall. Inside, people speak many languages, wear clothing from across the empire, worship gods you've never heard of. You're assigned to a workshop in the artisan quarter, sharing a small room with 3 deportees, and told to produce pottery for the royal household. Life continues. You eat, work, sleep. But you will never see Samaria again. Your children will grow up speaking Akkadian, worshipping Assyrian gods, perhaps even serving in the Assyrian army. Within 2 generations, your family's connection to Israel exists only as fragments of memory, stories told by elders that feel less real each time. The Assyrians understood identity as built on shared place, language, and ritual. Scatter people across distances, and resistance collapses. Archaeological records confirm this. Cuneiform tablets list Israelite names beside Babylonian and Phoenician ones, deliberately mixed throughout imperial cities. Life under Assyrian rule demanded tribute, labor, and conscripts. Tribute was fixed regardless of harvests, leaving populations on the edge of survival. Skeletal remains show stress markers, malnutrition, and untreated injuries. A letter reveals imperial logic. When a city collapsed under tribute, the king refused reduction. Instead, he ordered new deportees sent to replace the dead. The empire endured 3 centuries through terror alone. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, no one defended it. The city burned, its power vanished instantly. Reliefs still show executions and tribute processions, proof of fear as policy. The ruins remain, silent evidence of an empire that ruled through terror and left nothing worth saving.